November 1941, the Libyan desert, near the frontier between British-controlled Egypt and Italian Libya. Night fell quickly over a landscape that offered no cover, no roads, and no mercy. For the Axis forces dug in along the coast, the desert behind them was considered a natural shield, vast, empty, and impassable to anything larger than a patrol. Supply depots, fuel dumps, and forward airfields were positioned with that assumption firmly in mind. What the Axis command did not yet grasp was that the desert was about to become a weapon, and the British were learning how to use it. By late 1941, the North African campaign had settled into a brutal rhythm. British and Commonwealth forces faced an Axis system that relied heavily on long, vulnerable supply lines stretching from Tripoli and Benghazi eastward toward the front. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food had to move hundreds of miles across hostile terrain, often under air attack and with limited port capacity. Axis planners understood these vulnerabilities in theory, but in practice they believed the rear areas were safe enough to remain lightly defended. The front was where battles were expected to be fought. At the same time, Britain was reassessing how modern war could be fought in environments where conventional formations moved too slowly and predictably. Earlier desert experiments by the Long-Range Desert Group had already proven that small units, using navigation skill rather than roads, could penetrate deep into enemy-controlled territory. These patrols gathered intelligence and harassed the enemy, but their impact was limited. What Britain now needed was not just observation, but shock. Sudden, destructive blows delivered where the enemy felt most secure. It was in this context that the Special Air Service emerged, not as a grand strategic concept, but as a practical answer to a specific problem. The early SAS was small, under-resourced, and largely experimental. It lacked heavy weapons, armor, or air support on demand. What it did have was freedom of action, a willingness to accept extreme risk, and access to a vehicle that most armies still viewed as a simple utility machine: the Jeep. To many Axis officers, the Jeep appeared unimpressive. Lightly built, open to the elements, and unarmored, it seemed unsuited for serious combat. But those same characteristics made it something else entirely: fast, mechanically simple, and capable of crossing terrain that wheeled vehicles were not supposed to cross at all. In the hands of the SAS, the Jeep would cease to be transport. It would become a weapon system. What followed was not a single raid, nor a dramatic turning point overnight, but the steady unraveling of Axis assumptions about depth, security, and control. And that unraveling began far from the front lines, in places the enemy believed no British force could reach, a belief that would soon prove catastrophically wrong. The first attempt to translate the idea into results became a lesson in how unforgiving the desert could be. In November 1941, as 8th Army launched Operation Crusader to relieve Tobruk, Sterling's new unit was ordered to strike Axis airfields in support of the offensive. The method was bold but fragile. Parachute insertion at night, long movement on foot to aircraft dispersal areas, timed explosives, then withdrawal before dawn. In practice, weather turned the plan into disaster. High winds scattered the drop, broke up parties, and left men injured, lost, or forced to evade for days with limited water. Many never returned. The raid, remembered as Operation Squatter, failed to deliver the damage it promised and almost ended the experiment before it had begun. The Axis drew the wrong comfort from this failure. They read it as proof that the desert itself would defeat any deep raid, and that rear air bases and fuel parks could remain lightly defended as long as the front line held. The SAS response was not to abandon the concept, but to change the method. The solution came from an older desert institution, the Long-Range Desert Group. The LRDG had already proven that what looked empty on a map could be navigated with disciplined route planning, hard-won local knowledge, and a ruthless approach to fuel and water. Imperial War Museums notes that after the first abortive parachute attempt, the SAS relied on the LRDG to transport raiders to targets, earning the LRDG the nickname the Libyan Desert Taxi Service. Instead of dropping men into chaos, the SAS began to ride an overland, concealed inside deep desert movement, then approach targets from directions no conventional unit would dare. In December 1941, the difference was immediate. Transported overland and guided onto the right ground, SAS parties struck Axis airfields in Libya with raids designed for speed. Close in, destroy aircraft and fuel, then vanish before organized pursuit could form. An early success at Wadi Tamit helped keep the SAS alive at a moment when another failure might have ended it outright. These raids also pushed the unit toward a harder, faster attack method, with vehicles moving at pace through dispersal areas and hitting multiple targets in minutes rather than hours, a pattern that would soon become standard. The point was not only the aircraft destroyed, though the numbers could be punishing, but the shock delivered to the enemy's sense of control. Airfields and depots were meant to sustain the front. Now they were becoming liabilities, and the Axis had to choose between defending the rear or feeding the front, a dilemma that set the stage for the next evolution: the arrival of the armed Jeep as a purpose-built raiding weapon. By the middle of 1942, the SAS had learned a hard truth about deep raiding. Stealth alone was not enough. Getting to a target was only half the problem. The other half was what happened in the first 30 seconds after contact, when defenders finally understood what was happening. In that brief window, a raiding force either delivered decisive damage, or it was swallowed by the desert on the way out. This was where the Jeep became more than transport. In British hands, it was stripped down, lightened where possible, and turned into a fast-moving gun platform. The key was fire density, aircraft-style machine guns mounted in multiples, optimized for short, violent bursts at close range. The National Army Museum highlights the desert raiding context and the use of Vickers K-class guns mounted on Jeeps used by these long-range forces in North Africa. The logic was brutally simple. Parked aircraft, fuel bozers, and maintenance lines were fragile. If you could reach them at speed and saturate them with tracer and incendiary effect, you could destroy a disproportionate amount of enemy capability before anyone could organize a coherent defense. The approach also inverted the normal relationship between attacker and defender. A conventional airfield was designed to resist bombs from above with dispersal and camouflage. It was not designed to be overrun at ground level by a column of fast vehicles firing at point-blank range. That mismatch between what the base was built to endure and how it was actually being attacked was the SAS advantage, and it depended on speed, navigation, and surprise more than raw numbers. The best-known demonstration came on the night of 26 to 27 July 1942 at Sidi Hanish Airfield, in Axis-held Egypt. An SAS force drove in from the desert, then hit the airfield in columns of armed jeeps. Each vehicle carried multiple Vickers K machine guns, and the raid destroyed 37 aircraft according to the commonly cited operation summary. The deeper point was what those aircraft represented. Many were transport and operational platforms the Axis could not easily replace at that moment, and every loss forced new demands on already strained maintenance, fuel distribution, and air cover. This is why the phrase, "devastated their supply lines," is not just dramatic language. In the Western Desert, supply was airfields, trucks, fuel dumps, and the ability to move. Destroying aircraft on the ground was not only tactical, it was logistical sabotage. And once the SAS proved they could drive into the rear and erase a night's worth of air power in minutes, the Axis faced a problem that was larger than any single raid. How do you defend everything everywhere all at once, across a desert that refuses to have a front line? The answer the Axis reached was predictable. More guards, more wire, more patrols, more orders. After the first wave of successful overland raids, airfield commanders tightened perimeters, pushed sentries farther out, and positioned machine guns to cover the approaches that made sense on a map. Aircraft were dispersed even more widely. Fuel and ammunition were split into smaller dumps. Some units parked vehicles nose out for quicker reaction. These measures helped at the margins, but they also revealed the deeper problem. The Western Desert did not reward static defense. It punished anything that tried to hold too much ground with too few men. North Africa was already a war of arithmetic. Axis logistics depended on a narrow chain from Mediterranean ports to forward units, with much of it carried by road over vast distances. The farther east the front moved, the more fuel the Axis had to burn simply to deliver fuel, and the more vehicles wore out under sand, heat, and constant use. Any new defensive measure had a cost in transport capacity and maintenance hours. So when the SAS destroyed aircraft on the ground, the damage was not only to airframes. It interfered with reconnaissance, reduced escort and strike capacity, and in the case of transport aircraft, struck directly at the system that moved men, spares, and priority cargo faster than trucks could manage. Rear headquarters also tried to make targets harder to locate and harder to exploit. Camouflage improved. Dummy positions appeared. Lighting and routine were altered to confuse timing. Yet the SAS advantage was never built on perfect intelligence alone. It was built on reaching the rear by routes the enemy did not expect, then striking with a tempo that overwhelmed local reaction. Even a well-defended base still had to identify the threat, coordinate a response, and bring weapons onto fast-moving vehicles in darkness and dust. That took time, and time was exactly what the raiders denied. This is why the effect spread beyond airfields. Once the Axis accepted that the rear was permeable, everything became a security problem. Fuel parks, repair workshops, radio relay sites, and the road network that held the army together. The SAS and their desert partners increasingly focused on what the enemy could not replace quickly at the front: fuel, vehicles, and the ability to move. And as 1942 moved toward its decisive battles, the question was no longer whether the Axis could guard one base, but whether they could keep an army supplied while defending an entire rear area. In the Desert War, the supply line was not an abstraction. It was fuel in jerrycans, tires shredded by heat, engines choked by sand, and convoys that could not hide. Every Axis mile east of Tripoli lengthened the journey and multiplied the cost. When the British attacked that system head-on with naval interdiction and air power, the Axis could at least see the pressure coming. What they struggled to adapt to was a second kind of pressure. Raids that appeared out of the empty interior, struck the infrastructure that made movement possible, then disappeared before a conventional response could form. The SAS Jeep raids mattered because they forced the Axis to spend resources defending the rear at the exact moment the front demanded everything. Airfields, in particular, were not just places where aircraft sat. They were nodes in the logistics network. If transport aircraft were destroyed on the ground, it was not simply an air loss, it was a supply loss. Spares, fuel, ammunition, and priority cargo that now had to move by road instead, with all the delay and attrition that implied. The raid on Sidi Hainish on the night of 26 to 27 July 1942 is often cited for the scale of destruction, with 37 aircraft lost in a single strike, delivered by columns of armed jeeps moving fast across the dispersal area. Even when individual raids did not reach such totals, the cumulative effect was the same. Aircraft forced to disperse farther, bases forced to harden, and units forced to assign men and guns to guard duties rather than operations at the front. But the deeper impact sat in decision-making. Once commanders accept that their rear areas are vulnerable, they tend to overcorrect. They demand more patrols, more checkpoints, more wire, more lighting, more alert states, each of which consumes fuel, vehicles, and manpower. In North Africa, those were the very commodities already under strain. The desert did not give the Axis the luxury of creating a secure home front behind the lines. It gave them a single, fragile machine that had to keep moving. The SAS raids attacked that machine at its joints. Imperial War Museums emphasizes how the SAS, after early setbacks, leaned on the long-range desert group to reach targets deep behind enemy lines. Proof that the British approach was becoming systematic rather than improvised. The Axis could react to one raid. What they could not easily solve was the idea that any night might bring another, from another direction, against another airstrip or fuel park. And with that uncertainty spreading, the next question becomes unavoidable. How did the Axis try to adapt? And why did those adaptations still fail to prevent the continuing erosion of their operational freedom? The Axis did adapt, but adaptation in the desert always had a price. Airfields tightened perimeter defenses, dispersal areas were reorganized, and more units were pulled into guard duty and patrol schedules. Yet every new sentry post, every extra patrol vehicle, and every hour spent on rear area security drew from the same limited pool of fuel, transport, spare parts, and manpower that the front demanded. In other words, the SAS did not need to destroy an entire supply system in one night. They only needed to force the Axis to spend more than it could afford. More fuel to guard fuel, more trucks to protect trucks, more men watching the darkness instead of fighting at the decisive point. That is why the Jeep raids caught the Axis unprepared. They targeted the one vulnerability no amount of tactical skill could fully erase: distance. North Africa turned logistics into destiny, and the SAS exploited that reality with speed, navigation, and ruthlessly chosen targets. Aircraft on the ground, transport nodes, and the support structures that kept an army alive. By the time the wider campaign shifted with the great offensives of late 1942, the Axis was not only fighting the enemy in front, but also defending against the enemy that could appear behind them at any hour, from a direction the map insisted was empty. If you want more documentary breakdowns like this, where small units and overlooked machines changed the shape of the war, like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications.